Dear Ruham Hawash, dear Alexandre Liebeskind, dear Sim, dear Chiponda Chimbelu, dear participants here on site and participants at the screens, I warmly welcome you as an interim CEO of Rescue Committee Germany here to the Einstein Humanitarian Dialogue. A warm welcome to all of you. Unfortunately, Luisa Amtsberg cannot be with us because of an emergency back home, and this is, of course, sadly, but all the better is that we have a digital format. We have 30 people here on site and many, many more digital participants that have joined us from all over the world. Therefore, we have combined the best of both worlds. Just a housekeeping remark. First of all, the discussion tonight takes place in English and will be simultaneously interpreted into German. Here on site, you have the possibility to grab a headphone and to choose the language you want to listen to, and those joining online can do the same. Although the Einstein Humanitarian Dialogue takes place for the 5th time tonight, I would just briefly say something about the name. The Humanitarian Dialogue bears the name of Einstein because it was rightly so Albert Einstein who called for the foundation of the International Rescue Committee back in 1933, for reasons that are still relevant today, because many more people than ever before are relying on humanitarian aid. We are talking about 339 million people. Who wants to know more about those and the humanitarian crises that are currently raging? I recommend the read of the IRC Emergency Watch List that is published every year in December. Here you can find the top 10 of the worst humanitarian crises, analyses and possible solutions. You will find an example in addition here on your seat, and online the link will be shared in the chat. But let's come now to the event that is awaiting us tonight, continuities of impunity. So the humanitarian international law is one of the cornerstones of the international order. It guarantees the protection and safety and security of civilians and shall therefore avoid that humanitarian crises get out of control. But this cornerstone has gotten more and more shaky. This is what the media coverage shows from the crisis regions and all over the world. They are or you might have heard about those attacks on civil infrastructure like schools and hospitals. And those breaches of taboo have become the sad normality. At the same time, people affected by conflicts are hindered in their access to humanitarian aid. So on a yearly basis, 38,500 civilians die in conflict. This is twice as much as 5 years ago and more than 7 times as much as back in 2008. Those enormous breaches and violations of humanitarian international law usually stay without any consequence because lacking accountability and political will. The war in Ukraine is therefore only one of those examples, what we call the age of impunity in the IRC. So where the cornerstones of international order are shaking, committed countries like the Federal Republic of Germany bear a very important responsibility. Germany is the second important humanitarian donor and is one of the pioneers in defending multilateral order. A central role is taken up by civil society organizations. They support people that are affected by conflict on site, on the run, but as well in the host countries, and attract attention to untenable situations. Therefore, I'm all the more delighted to hand over to our panelists that will dig a lot deeper into the issue. So for all those attending here on site and those at the screens, I wish you a fruitful discussion and the concluding Q&A. With that, I hand over to the moderator, Chiponda Chimbelu. He is an editor and a news producer at the Deutsche Welle.
Right. So, hello and welcome to the 5th Einstein Humanitarian Dialogue. And as we heard from Corinna, the topic today is continuities of impunity, political pathways to end impunity under international law in crisis. And we have 3 guests today instead of 4 as was initially planned. We heard that the German government representative who was supposed to be here, Louisa Amsberg, had to unfortunately cancel due to a family emergency. But obviously this is an important topic and we will still discuss it today with the 3 people here next to me. And we have, to begin with, Ruham Hawash, and she is the co-founder and deputy director of Impact, which is a civil society organization here in Berlin, which also works with teams in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Lebanon. And next to Ruham, we have Alexandre Liebeskind, and he is with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. He is the director, the regional director for Francophone Africa at that organization. And of course, last but not least, we have Sam Duerden, and he is the Global Director for Humanitarian Access at the International Rescue Committee. And nice to have all of you. The panelists will be discussing the topic for the next 60 minutes. And at that point, after 60 minutes, we'll invite you, the audience, to participate with questions in English or German, whichever language you prefer. So we're looking forward to your questions as well. But to get started, I think we need to look back at the last 12 months. There's been a major shift in geopolitics in the world, it's fair to say. Germany's foreign policy has also changed. In fact, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, referred to the switch that we've seen in the last year as a Zeitenwende, so a turning point in the country's history and of course in the history of its foreign policy. And obviously that is affecting the work that humanitarians do on the ground. Sam, if you could maybe just tell us how the geopolitics in the world today are affecting the work of humanitarians on the ground.
Thanks, Chiponda. So from my perspective, supporting humanitarian access, supporting our colleagues around the world to obtain humanitarian access for people in need. We take account of the geopolitics, both in terms of the strategic environment, but also very concretely and operationally. So places we work, we're always having to negotiate access, the safety of our teams to reach people in need and to provide assistance that's good quality and based on need, based on principles. That means we're negotiating with the actors that control territory, control populations, control access routes, and are fighting. So that's often host governments, but it's also non-state armed groups as well. I think what we're seeing now is a diversification and an increase in the number of actors that are present in the places we're working. If we're thinking about the geopolitics in particular and the way that seems to be reshaping, actors such as Russia are increasingly present in places we work. Not thinking about Ukraine, which has obviously been top of mind recently, Syria before that, but in Africa, in the Sahel particularly, also in Sudan. So they influence the environment directly through presence of their diplomats, political and security forces, but also in terms of the behavior of governments in the places we're working as well.
Now, we also have someone on the panel today who actually negotiates with such actors, be they, conflict parties or governments, and that is Alexandre Liebeskind. So Alex, just tell us how the last 12 months have been and how maybe those changes in geopolitics are affecting your work.
Well, it's been rock and roll, I would say. We are witnessing a shift in empires, and shift in empires historically are always painful. So we shifted from a bipolar world after the Second World War to a unipolar world where the Western camp had it all. And now we are shifting again to a multipolar world with several empires competing for influence. And at the fringe of the empires, you will find conflict. And so somehow the Ukrainian conflict is the most visible phenomenon, I would say, of that shift of geopolitics. But you can see a replication of this pretty much in Africa, where the rivalry between Russia, China, and the West is very actively transforming the landscape. A little less than a year ago, a little more than a year ago, excuse me, the ambassador of France was expelled from Mali. That would have been unthinkable ever since decolonization. And since Mali has now shifted in the Russian camp, and before Mali, the Central African Republic has taken the same choice, and now Burkina Faso, we are seeing, is following the same route, meaning France and the West are losing grounds very rapidly in Africa, and this is the cause of worries, and this is also fueling conflict. But before that, or at the crossroad of that, Africa is also affected by the previous global war, which is a global war on terror, as it was called by the United States, where with jihadist movements that are very vigorous, that are gaining ground. And so what we are seeing is a competition between three governance models. The first one is the liberal democracies that are close to the West. The second one is military regimes that are authoritarian and tend to be close to Russia. And the third one is religious regime, theocracies, that are embodied by jihadist groups. And of these three, the one that is faring the less well is the democratic model. The democratic model is actually losing grounds to military regimes and to jihadists. So that calls for lots of talks in perspective. Yeah.
So we've heard there from Alex and Ruham. You work with organizations that are based in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, and obviously the geopolitics in the world right now. And those three different models we heard from Alex that are also probably unfolding in those countries that you have teams in. What have you seen in the last 12 months? What are the changes that you could perhaps share with us?
Yeah, well, working in the civil society, we have witnessed the interest shifting away from Syria and other conflict once the war against Ukraine erupted, and we have witnessed crimes that have been committed in Syria are being repeated again in Ukraine. Also, that bombing hospitals, public markets, attacking civilians, also under the flag of fighting terror has happened in Syria before, and now we are witnessing that going on in Ukraine again. This especially affects the civil society in Syria and neighboring countries, because the space itself for the civil society in general is shrinking. And now, especially after COVID and all the economic crisis following that, and accompanied by the Ukrainian war, this pushes us as civil society organizations to compete over funding and resources, which is also something that keeps happening every time another conflict pops up in the universe. So any developments here always have their effects there inside Syria and in the neighboring countries.
Thank you, Ruham. I think we get a sense of where things are headed. It's obviously a situation of more complexities because of the geopolitics. And we have a couple of videos also today that we would like to share with you from people who work in the field for the International Rescue Committee. And I would like to call on the technical team to play a video from Sama Youssef, and she is the IRC's Gender Safeguarding Manager in Yemen. So if we could just maybe have that video from Yemen, and then we will look at the topic that she brings up as well.
The 8 years old conflict in Yemen affected Yemeni people, women, men, boys and girls. During this period of conflict and due to the lack of the security and the absence of the state, serious human rights violation is happening. Thousands of people becomes a victim of killing, rape, harassment, especially in the IDPs camps. The court and justice system are not working effectively in Yemen. Impunity and the lack of accountability for those who are responsible of crimes against civilians give them a lesson to do more crimes and feel safe of punishment. Actually, impunity affects all of us in the humanitarian sector and decrease our ability to reach more vulnerable people, to continue providing service to our beneficiaries, to help the local communities and build their capacity. I would like to take this opportunity to call for step-up action and to support conflict countries like Yemen implementing accountability mechanism and to enhance also the justice system.
We have three competing models.
Ja, wir haben
a situation where civil society organizations are increasingly competing for resources. And of course, the situation is more complicated for humanitarian organizations on the ground. And law and justice are, of course, intertwined, and law is super important when it comes to fighting impunity. We heard earlier this month Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock say that international law needs to be strengthened. And she also said that law creates freedom. Now, Ruham was part of a very historic trial here in Germany that led to the conviction of 2 Syrian state security officers who had committed crimes against humanity in Syria and, of course, were also involved in torture and murder. And that was, of course, only possible because of Germany's universal jurisdiction principle for crimes against humanity. I think, Ruham, I'd like to turn to you and ask you what other instruments can help people like yourself who have suffered from such actions get more justice and accountability.
Yeah, well, there's a big toolbox in the international community for international justice and accountability, but unfortunately none of them were used in the case of Syria. Even Coblenz process, which I participated in, and several other trials happening now in France, Spain, also other trials in Germany, they are still not at the level of international accountability mechanisms and tools. So of course, this kind of trial and similar trials, they are able to bring back justice for us, at least individuals who participated in these trials. They can, to a limited extent, also stop people from, or like, that individuals would hesitate more to commit crimes against humanity, but this will not stop regimes from killing people and attacking peaceful civilians. And if these tools were not put in place to hold all these perpetrators accountable, these tools or these crimes will continue happening not only in Ukraine, but nobody knows where next. commando, the Russian commando that is now leading the operations in the war against Ukraine is the same one who bombed Aleppo back in a few years ago, and it was called Butcher of Aleppo, actually. And if the international community failed to hold these people accountable for their crimes, these crimes will continue happening. So it's not about the tool itself that we are going to use to hold these people accountable. It's about the willingness of countries and governments to stop these crimes and do something towards that.
And I just want to throw that to maybe Alex. How much of tool should international law be, especially for someone who's on the ground with conflict parties, also with governments, and negotiating and mediating in those circumstances? Is a stronger international law actually helpful on the ground?
Law works if you have a police force to run after the delinquents, and if you have jails to put them in. The problem of international law is there's nothing of that. There is the post Second World War construction was that the Security Council would be the policeman. The problem in the current situation is that the Security Council is paralyzed by the polarization between China and Russia on the one side and the other permanent members on the other side. So the Security Council cannot operate. And the Security Council has always been dependent on the veto right of its members. So we tend to have a short memory. I think this is called the Einstein Humanitarian Dialogue. I think that Einstein said the only thing that man learns from history is that man doesn't learn anything from history. And that is very, very true. That is, international law is weakened by the fact that those who promote it don't respect it themselves. There is an optical problem when you look at international law from the global south. The optical problem is most of the war criminals that have been detained at The Hague by the ICC are Africans. Most of them have been discharged for failure to condemn them. The aggression of Ukraine is a blatant violation of the United Nations Treaty. But not so long ago, the United States invaded Iraq without any consent from the Security Council. So legally speaking, it wasn't less bad. So maybe it was a just war, morally speaking. But in terms of law, countries, states tend to use international law as a weapon of war or as a weapon of propaganda. So as long as there is not a fair application of international law, it will be weak. This being said, there is a consensus on one body of law, and that body of law is the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions rule the way you can use force in conflict. The Geneva Conventions were written by military. They were written by the very people who won Second World War. So it leaves states very ample use of force. It does not forbid the use of force, but it sets very clear limits as to what constitutes a war crime. What are the limits to the use of force? It's the only international treaty that has been ratified by all the countries of this planet. And so countries should be firm on the application of the Geneva Conventions.
Ruham, I'll turn back to you. What role do you think that civil society organizations could play in this strengthening of international law? Do you think there's a role for civil society organizations to play? And based on your experience, I mean, are you involved in any talks to maybe look at ways of doing that?
Yeah, well, I will speak from my experience during Kaplan's process and my interaction with several civil society organizations and actors that have participated in supporting the trial. Many, let's say, aspects of the trial couldn't be documented well enough without the Syrian and German civil society engaging with the Koblenz process, because the German law itself, and as an example, the German court does not it's not that it doesn't care, but the German court it's not of its tasks to document this trial in Arabic language, for an example, for the people who would mostly benefit from these reports and hearing about this process, etc. So this has been done by the civil society organizations that are working around the trial and supporting the lawyers team. And these organizations, they have also helped in filing the cases, in building solid cases that could be also provided to the general prosecutor. And without these efforts, I guess Koblenz trial and other trials wouldn't be possible, because also reaching out to families of victims, and victims also needs a lot of access to the Syrian society, for an example, that German lawyers couldn't have achieved alone, for an example. So all the interaction of the civil society around the Koblenz made Koblenz more accessible for Syrian people, and this is a very important aspect. This is what gives this trial a meaning, not only for me and the people who sued these individuals, but also it could extend these feelings of justice and rewarding for also wider spectrum of the Syrian community. So this is just as an example from Koblenz. Also the documentation of anything that has also around the trial itself, documentation of how is it called, of the testimonies and etc. Many informations that couldn't be used in this trial could be used in that trial. And here also comes the role of civil society to work with these elements and with these informations, and try to put them where the politics, how is it called? The Rechtssystem.
The law system.
Yeah, the law system. Yeah, the justice system. So wherever these information are needed, actually the civil society plays a huge role in channeling these information. Also another thing also about the advocacy and about the advocacy around the trial itself and the dissemination of trial reports and trial outcomes, etc. So the civil society also there played a very crucial role at that trial.
And we've also heard, we heard about the role of the civil society organizations, but we've also heard of a double standard in terms of applying, international law, where we feel, or there's a feeling that Western governments aren't as targeted by any efforts. I mean, of course, another example is that Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, has called for the establishment of a special tribunal for Ukraine, but you don't see such efforts targeting Western governments. What is the feeling on the ground, Sam, when that is the case? Is this something that is being discussed on the ground in African countries? How does it affect humanitarian access in some areas? What does it mean for your work?
I think the feeling on the ground, and I wouldn't presume to speak for people in Africa or people who are suffering from the effects of war, but it's usually much more practical than that. It's day-to-day needs, survival, food, water, which is what partly what humanitarian law obliges parties to conflict to provide. I think when we think about the past year, Ukraine has dominated the agenda and public consciousness in Europe and, let's say, globally. But in Africa, it hasn't been the top item on the agenda, for sure, because conflicts that have been raging there for some time have continued at large scale. Figures recently provided in Tigray were up to 600,000 people who may have died in the last 2 years. In parts of East Africa, the risk of famine persists, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. And even short of famine, the classification level below famine means severe hunger. It means people are already not having enough to eat, children aren't growing properly, and at risk of dying from disease. So there may be double standards and hypocrisy, but that doesn't excuse any actor who is responsible for the well-being of people from their obligations. Hypocrisy isn't necessarily the worst vice, but it's no excuse for actors who have responsibilities to cite double standards as a reason for excusing them. I think what it does do is affects the influence and moral credibility of countries in the West, for example, who may be perpetuating those double standards when they want to try and influence others. And I think that's an important question in the era that we're going into, is how we can actually encourage and persuade and get adherence and commitment to the moral norms that underlie these laws. There are ethical commitments there, and that's what we need to try and persuade people to adhere to.
You mentioned Africa there, and of course we also know that the country that tops the list, the IRC's emergency watch list, is Somalia. And I want to bring in a video from Somalia just to give us a sense of where things stand there, and then we will move on after we hear what's been said in that video. So if the technical team can just prepare, it takes a couple of seconds, so just bear with them.
So the main things we're facing, there are malnutrition issues that have accumulated, particularly affecting children under 5. We're having huge issues of food insecurity. People are not getting enough food to eat. Access to water. So the IRC is supporting all of these areas where these needs have arisen. And maybe one other thing, and the last time I was visiting, protection has become a big issue, where people have been impacted by the displacement, by not having the protection infrastructure that they're used to in their homes and in their communities. They're more exposed when they're displaced and when they're in these internally displaced camps. I think the biggest thing affecting compounding the drought situation in Somalia is the instability that we're facing from a security standpoint. Many of the displaced are conflict displaced, people that have left their homes because their herds have been raided, their homes have been raided, young men have been pulled off to become soldiers. This sort of thing is compounding the drought situation and adding to the overall numbers and stretching humanitarian resources.
Humanitarian resources, and we also heard from Corinna in the opening statement that around 339 million people will be in need of humanitarian aid this year alone, and that's higher than, of course, previous years. There's also a 27 billion funding gap in terms of humanitarian support that we had last year. We're assuming that will be higher this year. How are things looking on the ground, and just maybe if you could just tell us more about that, Sam.
Well, needs are continuing to grow, and we continue to need more resources and money. That's probably not a surprise for a humanitarian organization to say that. Ukraine has diverted not just attention, but resources. There are budget cuts to some of our programs in parts of East Africa and Asia. The figures you mentioned in terms of total funding requirements for humanitarian responses are unfunded. I was in Myanmar in November, and the response plan there is only 25% funded, and there are 14 million people in need there, similar numbers to in Syria. So there is a big gap. Some of those challenges are because donors are not stepping up with money. Some is because money is directed to what is politically, has a political profile or a public profile. And sometimes there are severe access challenges which makes it hard to deliver aid. And that's a responsibility of states and governments, but also armed groups that are controlling the territories and engaging in the conflicts that are generating the humanitarian needs.
And Ruham, you obviously also work with countries that have been, on that list for a while now, with teams in Syria and of course in Iraq as well. How is that lack of resources affecting you? Have you received less funds for these areas, and how is it affecting your work? I just want to get a sense of where things stand at this point.
Yeah, well, there is always something that comes up to shorten our resources. So it's not only what have been mentioned, but we keep struggling with funds and actually not only funds. There are several technical let's say, obstacles stay in the way of humanitarian aid and humanitarian support, like the UN Security Council resolution of delivering aid, about delivering aid to Syria, that has been prolonged a few weeks ago. Yeah, I mean, this thing alone is actually a human rights violation, is to have all these amount of people, million of people behind these borders, and then sit in the Security Council and discuss if we want to deliver them food for the next 6 months or not, as if it's something that needs to be discussed. I mean, I really, every 6 months, I really wonder, why do we have to go through this again and again and again? And we as civil society organizations, we gather ourselves and we write statements, and we start forwarding our statements to ministers, trying to convince them again about how important and crucial is it to prolong such resolution. And it's not only about the fund, and that is we are lacking. We are lacking solidarity, international solidarity. We are lacking international understanding and also commitment to these conflicts and to the people who are living in these countries of these conflicts. And with here I mean a sustainable commitment and like not leaving these people alone once another thing in the universe happens in some place else.
So I just want to put this question out. Is then humanitarian aid being more of a political tool, a geopolitical tool, a tool for realpolitik, or that would be just the response to what's going on? Alexandre? Alex, maybe if you could let us know what you think.
Humanitarians themselves define needs according to what the people tell them, right? But now, how states allocate funding can be very political. I mean, there are obviously conflicts that attract more attention than others. So in itself, I wouldn't blame humanitarians, but certainly countries tend to be very political in their choices, and we see now the amounts that are being shipped to Ukraine. This, of course, again seen from the global south, is a bit of a bitter pill. That is. The message is actually you do have resources, and actually when you want, you can concentrate them. But what is a bit sad in all that is that most of the money goes to weaponry, and that has never solved any major problem on this planet, frankly. If we look at our recent track record of arming allies, be it in Vietnam or in Afghanistan or in Syria or in Libya, it's not terrific, is it? But again, it looks like politicians are not very creative, I would say. That's one. And two, if you really want to promote democracy, human rights, you have to invest in education. You have to massively invest in primary education. Sam and I are working in areas where actually demographic pressure is such that the youth is less and less educated. There are less schools being built than kids being born in Africa. In the Sahel region, the fertility rate is of about 6 children per woman. And the average classroom, primary classroom, has 1 teacher for 150 students. So what do you teach kids with that? So fighting regimes, authoritarian regimes from the outside is a difficult task. Fighting them from the inside is a long task, but that requires long-term investments and to start with education.
I think Sam wants to add something. Maybe go ahead and say what you wanted to say, and then I'll jump in with my question.
Thank you, Chiponda. I just wanted to come back to Ruham's point about the recent renegotiation of cross-border access into Syria for 6 months. Good, but not acceptable. I used to work in Syria between 2013 to 15 and crossed the border from Turkey and Iraq regularly. And the humanitarian assistance that was crossing there was keeping people alive. And giving hope as well. In recent years, that cross-border resolution has been for 12 months. The fact it is now 6 months is not an accident. It's designed to continue squeezing the assistance that goes over there. 6 months is not enough time to plan and mobilize the sort of resources that need to go over and continue assisting people in Syria. So that's an example of the UN Security Council unable to do its job, essentially. And it's unaccountable to anyone but itself. And this is where we need to try and think and be creative, and politicians being creative about how we can change that, whether it's the General Assembly having more influence or having more say in some of these questions, or as IRC would like to see an independent organisation to monitor humanitarian access, because NGOs can't speak out often because we will be kicked out or harassed or arrested or attacked, and the UN increasingly is paralysed politically. So it's a really good example of some of these challenges, I think.
Well, since you mentioned Syria again, I think it's probably the best time to bring in the video that we have from Syria, from the IRC's Syria country coordinator, Tanya Evans, and I think we should have a listen to what she had to say, and then we can move on.
While a ceasefire in the northwest of the country has resulted in a reduction in fighting since 2020, airstrikes and shelling continue to be a reality for many on the ground. Just recently, escalations in the northeast have once again resulted in civilian death. Across the country, civilians pay the highest price for escalations. Further escalation in 2023 would once again result in many having to uproot their lives in search of safety. On top of this already bleak reality, the economic situation in Syria continues to deteriorate rapidly. Families are no longer able to put food on the table, and children are being forced out of school and into work in order to support the household. Syria is facing the worst hunger crisis it has ever seen, and on top of this, healthcare needs continue to rise rapidly. Since the beginning of the crisis, attacks on hospitals and health facilities have become a hallmark of the conflict and have left the healthcare system severely unable to support the millions of Syrians in need of health assistance. Despite civilians and access to healthcare being protected under international humanitarian law, attacks continue. Without accountability, civilians will continue to pay the highest price and death tolls will continue to rise.
It sounds like the situation, of course, is worsening elsewhere, at least in other crises. And the question I'd like to ask is, have Western politicians, Western governments taken the eye off the ball when it comes to other crises? Alex?
Have they ever had their eyes on the ball, I would say, but I would say this: the focus on the Ukraine war is perfectly understandable. It's a direct threat to Western Europe. It is somehow sentimentally closer to us, and we tend to have more empathy with what we relate with. So I would say this is perfectly legitimate. I am worried that within a few days after the Russian aggression, any sense of neutrality or humanity was simply swept away. Concerts of Russian composers were cancelled. Access to healthcare for Russians was forbidden in Switzerland, in my own country. The level of hatred against Russia as a whole has set us back decades in the whole enterprise in trying to understand that you should not stigmatize people. People are victims of geopolitics, and they are victims of their governments. Any talk of engaging in negotiations with Russia is met with incredible aggressivity from Ukraine, which is normal. Ukraine wants to win the war. But there should be voices of wisdom saying there is no conflict that has ended without an element of negotiation. Sometimes to cut corners if there's an overwhelming victory, but there is no conflict that has ever ended without an element of negotiation. And so a space for talks should be preserved. So I'm worried that the very notion of the neutrality of humanitarian action, the neutrality of peace talks, is being challenged by the West, and that will make our work more difficult in the future, I think.
You mentioned Russia a lot there, and I think it's also worth noting that Sergei Lavrov was in South Africa this week, and of course there's military exercises announced between the Russian army, I think the South African army, and also the Chinese army. Now, what does the further isolation of Russia mean for humanitarian work in Africa? Because of course it seems to make sense from a European point of view, as we would see things here. But what does it mean for your work and the work of several of your colleagues, hundreds of your colleagues, Sam?
It's a good question, and I think we're going to start finding out. I don't think we know yet, but it's something we need to start understanding. It can potentially impact us in operational settings in a couple of ways. One is the direct presence potentially of Russia. But the other is how governments behave and the decisions they take with Russian support. And I think the example of Sergei Lavrov visiting South Africa is a very clear sign that countries have different options and different relationships with Russia to what we may think of in Europe, in Western Europe. So it will start changing the dynamics. From a very practical point of view as a humanitarian organization, we need to be able to talk to whoever we need to be able to talk to obtain access, to obtain safety assurances for our teams, and to try and influence and encourage good behavior, protection of civilians. So for us, it's not a question of whether we talk to Russia, and it doesn't have to be Russia, it's armed groups that we talk to. It can be very hostile and extreme armed groups, but it's how we can do it effectively. And I think the risk is that, as Alex says, Russia becomes so excluded from the possibility of negotiation or dialogue that it becomes impossible. So whatever the competition that is going to increase in terms of security, trade, territory, ideology, we need to maintain a humanitarian dialogue to protect victims of conflict, whether that's in Ukraine or whether it's in Africa or any other theatre globally.
May I follow up on that, Yves? Then again, we tend to have a short memory, but Africans and Russians alike have a long memory. So when the West was cozying up with the apartheid regime, Soviet Union was supporting the ANC. The Soviet Union has been a steady support of the ANC all the way. And this has not been forgotten in the memory of South Africans. That's one. Two, South Africa is an interesting example of the very topic of this session. That is, what is remarkable in the peace process that led to the end of apartheid is that the two leaders, Nelson Mandela and de Klerk, agree that there will be a transitional justice process whereby whoever confesses to crimes publicly will be spared from from prosecution. And that process, which was a public process, was one of the most successful way to heal the wounds of the past, but also to get the minority of the white people who were holding the country to somehow be able to remain in the country and somehow reconcile with the vast majority of Africans.
So that brings us back to the concept of justice, conciliation, and so forth. And I think I want to turn back to Ruham. Just what forms can justice take as someone who was, of course, involved in a trial here? But I mean, how do you think of justice? And I mean, this is an ongoing process because, of course, the conflict in Syria is not solved. So what kinds of discussions do you have around the topic of justice? And what, I mean, we're talking about impunity, of course, but what could that take? What form could that take?
Yeah, well, around Kablin's trials and other trials happening now in Germany and in Europe, there is a huge discussion amongst Syrians if this is justice, or if it's just like justice for a few of us, or if it's justice in general. Well, for me, as an individual, I didn't know anything about justice before I entered this process, and the process itself was my way to figure out the concept of justice, to develop the concept of justice, and to have a standing point also in the topic of justice. Without going through this process, I wouldn't have developed this concept of justice in my personality and in my mindset. And I guess this is something very crucial here, because when we talk as Syrians as justice, not everyone means the same thing, and not everyone has gone through the same thing. But we all seek justice. But the justice we seek is the path to heal our wounds. And if we can heal it in an individual level and also collectively, this plays a very important role of defining justice for us as a community. So I see justice as a very fluid concept. it depends on how we use justice itself to heal our wounds and to reconcile and move toward new phases as a society and as country in rebuilding and reconciling. And I guess without everyone in Syria passing through this process of knowing justice, developing the concept of justice on themselves, we will not be able to reconcile as a society. So to go, like, what justice do we need for the Syrian society? It's everything. It's comprehensive justice, brings people who are outside, bring them back to Syria, expose the stories about the people who were kidnapped and arrested and detained, and we don't know their place until now, and they are like forcibly disappeared since years. Is also to know about their fate is justice. Justice is also to be able to restore our identity as Syrians and as part of the Syrian fabric. Is justice is to, like, it's at a very different level, and it can't be reached by a trial or a set of trials, or even by only pursuing perpetrators. But it's a bigger, wider process that involves so many actors, and I guess to be able to go there, it needs also, and again, international commitment and belief in the suffering of these people and the right of these people to go through this process.
Okay, thank you. And Alex, since you are a mediator, and we just heard Ruham say that justice is a fluid concept, is there an understanding with diplomats, politicians, of justice as a fluid concept, and of course with someone who mediates, how different are the discussions you have, there and then here?
There is seldom a peace agreement without an element of impunity. Historically, impunity has been part of peace processes. So if we look back at 1596, the Edict of Nantes, which closed the war of religion between Protestants and Catholics in France, starts, the first article says that we agree that we will never talk about the violence and the war anymore, and that all crimes committed during that time are forgiven. Even in case of overwhelming victory, such as the victory of the Allies against Germany or Japan, there was an element of impunity in the surrender agreement. In the case of Germany, the decision was that the Nuremberg trial would concentrate on a handful of leaders, but that the millions of members of the Nazi Party or the millions of members of the SS would not be trialed. And in the case of Japan, the only condition of Japan for surrender was that the emperor should be protected as a figure. And there the idea was, in both cases, we will help reconstruct these nations. And to say the truth, both Japan and Germany are probably historically the best examples of conflicts transformation. But it's not over. It's not over. A lot of the history needs to be told. So in peace processes, if your entry point with the belligerents is you will end up your days in jail, your chances of getting concessions in peace are considerably smaller. So Basically, parties in a conflict negotiate in two situations. The first is one is winning over the other, and they decide to cut corners. In that case, the power relationship is such that you can push for you can push for justice. But even in that case, you have to concede. So a recent example is the peace process between the government of Colombia and the FARC, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia. The FARC agreed to enter into talks in one condition: ni un día en la cárcel, not even one day in jail. That was the initial deal. And this is how they accepted to lay down their weapons. And then there was a very elaborate system that was put in place whereby those who confessed for committing crimes could be trialed for a maximum and sentenced for a maximum of 7 years of common works. It's a very light sentence for people who killed and abducted and what have you. But that was the price to pay for Colombia to put an end to 50 years of guerrilla. Then you have less brilliant deals. I've been involved in the talks in Khartoum over the peace agreement between the government of Central Africa and the 14 armed groups. And there you find yourself negotiating leader by leader the conditions of them laying down their weapons, including the kind of titles they will get in the government, right? It's not brilliant. But there, the humanitarian imperative is such that if that can slow down violence for a while, if that can open the road for one, the state to reinforce itself, two, for a much more inclusive debate, a much more inclusive peace process, then why not? But you're aware of the fact that it's more or less a deal between mafia leaders, whereby they share the streets of Chicago in terms of the business, right? So there is always an element of impunity, but there is no, I would say there is no peace without impunity, but there's no lasting peace without justice. So peace agreements should open the way to processes whereby at least, at minimum, people will be able to express their sufferings and their experiences, and whereby perpetrators will be confronted with this, and perpetrators will ask for forgiveness. It sounds futile, but asking for forgiveness makes a huge difference and can actually heal the wounds of the past.
Well, thank you, Alex. And I think we've come to that point, 60 minutes roughly, and I want to invite the audience as well to ask their questions at this time. And of course, we talked about, impunity being part of the peace process and justice being fluid. I don't know what other questions you would have, but that's what we ended on right now. There's two mics both sides of the room, and Alex over there and Lydia have the mic, so you can just raise your arm and ask your question. And of course, if you're joining us online, you can submit your question via the chat function. Feel free to use German or English. We obviously understand both languages here, so looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the panel. This is my 5th the Einstein Humanitarian Dialogue. So you still fascinated me, and I still learned a lot of new things.
Could you just tell us what your name is and where you're from?
My name is Christine. Most of them know me. I actually work for the IRC, and I'm responsible for private sector funding. And this is now my question, or it's a combined question for you and for me. We're listening to this, and then we go home, and then we're like, oh, the world is horrible, but what can we do? And so my question would be, is there anything that people in the audience, but also online, could do really, like specifically, to bring change? And I know this might be very naive, but I give an example. I know some of our supporters are listening. I think we need funding for advocacy work so that we can really, because, I mean, Sam, you spoke about lack of funding in our humanitarian context. That's horrible, but for me, as seeking funding, it's very difficult to get funding for advocacy work. We do have interest in funding, for example, for our European, like our fight in European borders, protection, and the impunity that's currently happening there. So I'm really welcoming the support. Yeah, but do you have any? That was my suggestion to the audience, but what would be yours so that we get out here and we have something to hold on to? Thank you.
All right, thank you. I don't know, Ruham, you work with a civil society organization. That's a question that seems to be also directed to someone who's, you know, with a civil society organization.
Yeah, well, supporting advocacy is a tool, yeah, it's needed, and also maybe supporting knowledge development and research, because there is very limited work on research and assessments, and we are like also after 10 years of the conflict in Syria and many international actors and organizations, we still witness like non-related project being implemented and waste of resources in some areas, and that's basically, from my point of view, it's based and linked to the lack of knowledge also about these contexts. So support, not only supporting the advocacy for solidarity, but also support these communities themselves, wherever they are, to develop and create knowledge and content about their conflicts and also their dynamics and contexts. So maybe this is something from my personal point of view.
Any of the other panelists want to add anything?
A couple of things. It's always good to donate to the IRC, whether for operations or similar. There are other organisations out there, yeah. But I would other things as well is for people to vote for governments that take these issues seriously, because it's governments that can actually make major changes. It's their political and military decisions that change people's lives. The other thing I would say is for people to really educate themselves and take care with the information that they get. There is a lot of misinformation and disinformation in the world. I think the information environment, both globally and in generally, but also for humanitarian actors, is completely different to when I started working for IRC 15 years ago. And a lot of that misinformation is deliberate to undermine humanitarian work, humanitarian objectives, undermine fights for justice, discredit people. So be really careful with the information, use trusted sources and do research.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? Here, okay, there's two. There's one there and there's one over there. So I don't know how we can make this more efficient, but maybe we can start with the lady over there and then we'll head over to you. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Jumana. I'm a legal advisor in the International Crimes and Accountability Program at ECCHR, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. So maybe I don't have a question, but I have a comment, especially as a Syrian, maybe to the point that have been raised about peace and negotiation and justice or impunity in particular. So I think now, 12 years now, we are suffering. Half of us as a population, as a Syria, we are outside Syria. We are refugees in the neighboring countries and Europe and everywhere. We lost, half of the population lost their life. That's mean history, background, families, everything. And we have, children without education, no, yeah, a lot. It's painful at least, but more than 1 million with a special need as a result of the war. And all these price is just because we asked our very basic human rights things, you know, dignity, freedom, all these like basic rights for. So now it's really very painful. And now with the idea that it started that recycling the regime and re-accepted him, and many countries asking for this and start the process. And now we are hearing a lot of voices saying, it's okay, now it's peace. If we want, you know, peace, impunity should be part of the process. So I think the question that it's what is justice for the Syrian people, justice is at least is a transitional change. It's a democratic transition to move after all these price, at least to move to different situations, different position, to achieve for maybe not for us, but the children, the families of the survivor, the families of the victims who paid their life for this, to achieve this goal that it was really very high price. So justice, it's need. I think justice for the Syrian, it's firstly, it's no impunity for anyone, or the move to that, and accountability. Even not the criminal accountability, but accountability, it should be part of this. Impunity should be out. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if there's any further responses to that, or if we can just, anything to add, or just briefly, maybe.
Yes, Syria is a very painful example of how to get things wrong. The conflict in Syria, from your perspective and from the perspective of the Syrians, was a conflict of the people against the regime, against the government. I'll make you a confession. I met several times with Bashar al-Assad, and I met several times with Lavrov and with Obama at the time. Strangely enough, but as most war criminals, Bashar al-Assad is a very nice man when you meet him. But that's the problem with the war criminals. They look nice. But whatever. My point here is. It was not really about democracy. It was about Russia gaining back strength and drawing a line in the sand to the West, saying we will not accept to lose more territory. Russia had just lost Libya. And to say the truth, in Libya, the West played a very dirty game. That is, the West got the Security Council to agree on the no-fly zone on Syria, to the condition explicitly asked by the Russians that it would not be used to topple down Colonel Gaddafi's regime. The West violated its promise. The West used the no-fly zone to actually arm the rebels that then toppled the regime. And Jesus, 12 years down the line, what a catastrophe. Libya is still at war. When an insurgency started in Syria, the position of Russia was very clear. We don't really care about the regime. We care about our influence in the world. We have to show our allies that it is worth being allied with Russia. We let Gaddafi down. If we leave al-Assad down, what will people think? So whenever the West will provide one Kalashnikov to the Free Syrian Army, we will provide 2 to the government. And to the contrary of the West, we will actually deploy troops on the ground. Don't forget that Syria is probably the first war led by the West where we don't send a single soldier because we don't want to take human losses. Russia sends soldiers, and Russia leads the most brutal war on the insurgents. That war destroyed Syria. That war also gave birth to the most brutal form of jihadist groups in Syria, amply funded and armed by the West. Let us not forget that. We went all the way to arm and fund the very people who were fighting in the other war just across the border in Iraq, right? Global war against terror. So I feel deeply sorry for the people of Syria, and I think that the Syrians must feel extremely lonely these days, as do the Palestinians probably. It's an unfinished business. We have literally vitrified the country, and now we don't really care anymore. So it's a sad story. Keep it on the radar screens, and accountability should not only go to those regimes, but it should also go to those politicians in the West that engaged people's money in supporting insurgencies and just let them down. So either you fight a war and you win a war, or you do it differently. And there are different ways to do it. I'm a man of talks and negotiations. And as a man of talks and negotiations, you have to be a bit smart. I mean, you have to outsmart your enemy. And the best way to outsmart your enemy is the so-called kiss of the spider. Okay? Flood this money with support for their education systems. One generation down the line, people will rebel. This is exactly what's happening now in Iran.
All right. Thank you, Alex. The lady over there, is the question still valid? Okay, great. So if we just get a mic to her. And I think we'll also, there's a gentleman over there with a question, and I would want to, at some point, include the online questions as well, but I have that order, 2, 3, all right, okay. Oh, yes, I'll remember. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. My name, I'm from Tafel Deutschland, German food bank, but that's irrelevant to my question, really. We've heard, particularly from Mr. Liebeskind towards the end, a case for impunity as a tool to move on, to pacify countries after a conflict. And so really the question I would like to ask to the entire panel is, what is the right balance to strike between offering impunity as a means to end a conflict versus ending impunity as a means to prevent conflicts from occurring or from spiraling out of control?
So it's to the entire panel. Maybe we can have Sam start now, and I'll try to ask all of you to be a little bit brief because we have a lot of questions waiting. So just if you could go first.
I don't have an answer. I'll just give a perspective on it from a humanitarian organization's viewpoint with 2 examples. So for us, we're not really a player in peace negotiations. We negotiate for humanitarian access and assistance, and we try to deliver that in whatever the situation at hand is. The question you raise comes up for us often in terms of the balance between when it's right to stay and deliver and keep quiet and when it's right to leave and make a point. And Myanmar is one example that has emerged in recent years, a real conflict between the presence and engagement of humanitarian organizations and the aspirations for democracy of people there. And there's real pressure on humanitarian organizations and the UN not to engage with the military authorities in that country at the moment to provide assistance. I don't know what the right answer is there. And most recently in Afghanistan, with the Taliban's recent edict that women can no longer work for NGOs. What can we do? That's a huge question. Practically, we can't operate, but ethically, it's just wrong. It's against our values. Do we leave or do we stay and try and deliver as much as we still can, because there are people on the verge of famine? So they're real ethical dilemmas, and there isn't an answer. All we can try and do is make the best judgment we can, incorporating and reflecting the views of people that are affected as much as possible in there.
Alex, and yeah, 30 seconds.
Yes.
All right, so your answer deserves a book, but if you dig in our website, we actually issued a doctrine on amnesty. So impunity is never a good deal. Impunity means people are not accountable for the crimes they committed. And not holding people accountable for the crimes they committed is the recipe for the repetition of wars. The unaddressed crimes pass from generation to generation. And you can see again, I'm coming back to that, but you can see now in Ukraine all the rage that unaddressed crimes by the Soviets at the time has been passed from one generation to the other. And in Africa, most of the conflicts are actually conflicts between communities that then fuel political conflicts. But you are dealing with sometimes hundreds of years of oppression of one community on the other, on farmers over herders or what have you. So these things need to be addressed, or conflicts repeat. Impunity is therefore never the solution. Amnesty is a way to facilitate peace processes, to facilitate belligerents laying down the weapons, while keeping an element of accountability that will allow you to answer to one, the right of the people to know the truth, and that the truth be said, two, the right to reparations, and reparations can be symbolic, or they can be individual, or they can be collective, but people deserve reparations. And three, the guarantee of non-repetition. So you are dealing with constant and heavy ethical dilemmas. At some stage you have to be pragmatic, but you shouldn't be too pragmatic either. Now, justice has its time. It took... I have to stop? Okay, sorry.
I think we're gonna have to stop you there, because Ruham, do you want to add anything to that? The balance between... Okay, you were good. Okay, so let's pass the mic on to... to the gentleman over there, and then we have two other people, and then I need to get in the online questions as well from Esgri. So, okay, you go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Mohammed Noor. I'm an Bildung officer, education officer by IRC Germany. I haven't a question, I have a comment, but I don't know if I can speak it in German, if that's okay. Okay. Also ich habe mehrere Notizen geschrieben.
So I took various notes when I was coming here, and I was also taking notes here. Many of the things that I noted down have been covered and discussed here. Let me start with the Koblenz trial. Torture, murderers, and crimes committed in Syria. I mean, all these people must not live a free life anymore, and they should not go unpunished. I mean, we need trials not just in Germany, but also in other countries. And Bal al-Hawa. I have contacts with multiple people who provide humanitarian aid in northwestern Syria. There's a huge need for humanitarian aid there. And of course, at the international level, we have to continue to provide humanitarian aid. I have another point that has not yet been mentioned. It refers to the German level. In Germany, we have Syrian refugees. We have hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, and they are forced to get a pass from the embassy of the regime, and it costs 800 euros in Germany. And this is compulsory, and the money goes directly to the Assad regime. So it is basically a financial support of the Syrian regime. And then with this money, they bombard other members of the family that are still in the country, or they bombard other areas and organizations. And as I said, people must not be forgotten only because the media doesn't report on this anymore. I mean, we do know this here, but in the media, we do not hear much about Syria and Iraq anymore, and it is our task to shed light on every individual destiny. And now, one personal experience that I would like to share with you. In this house that you can see on the photo, I mean, this is a Kyuan charitable hospital. I got surgery in 2009. This is 20K away from my house. So I got surgery in this hospital. And this is something that I wanted to share with you. This building was bombarded more than 20 times until 2019, over a period of 10 years, and the same happens in other countries. And nothing has changed. We still need pressure from the international level on the regime. Hospitals, schools, markets, civil places must not be bombarded. They have to be protected. And another point, many people, and this is a personal example, who are still in refugee, should not become refugees. My parents were expelled and displaced more than 30 times within the country. And offers have to be made, but they were told you're not going to become refugees, although they always had to start from scratch with their lives. But people stay in this country, and we have to open up new prospects for them, like Ruham and Jumana said. Thank you very much.
I think we need to take the online questions now. I don't want to let our virtual participants feel left behind, and so I think we have a bunch of questions. I think Ezgi will just read them out.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we just have one from Leonhard Grana, and this one's to you, Sam. With regard to the question of the local effectiveness of global legal systems, Sam Duerden referred to the importance of the ethical foundations of these norms. Sam, from your work experience with different people on the ground, what factors enable or impede the building of intercultural consensus on the modern functionality of human rights as a protection of human dignity?
I think I can give one comment on that, and then perhaps can invite my friends if they have opinions as well. When I was speaking about how principles and ethical norms underpin certain legal systems, I was speaking specifically around humanitarian law. And the principles of humanity in conflict, and the principles of protecting people who are not participating in that conflict, victims of that conflict, injured people, sick people, people who aren't fighting, civilians. And partly the reason I said that was to do with this idea of how you build consensus across either cultures or warring parties, when I go or my colleagues go to speak to people who are fighting and try and negotiate access or space for our humanitarian programs, we don't usually go in and lecture them on international humanitarian law because the conversation wouldn't last very long. It's also very complicated. So we try and build consensus around what I think exists, and maybe this is, well, it's not idealistic, I think it's factual. I think the extent to which individuals adhere to this is a question, but every culture, I think, and historically as well as contemporaneously, has values of protecting people in conflict, people who are not fighting. And that is what IHL, the modern legal system, has grown out of. Earlier versions of that, not just from the West, but in China and other martial codes. Russia actually convened a lot of the first conferences on international law, and they're all built on ethical principles. So that was the point I was trying to get at, and I think that there are feelings of empathy and solidarity and humanity across cultures, and that's what we need to try and find when we're discussing some of these issues in terms of our ability to provide assistance to people.
All right, I hope that answers the question for the person online. And we have 2 more questions that I have to take, yes, and I think those will be our final questions. I think I would like to have both of you ask them one after the other. So just pass on the mic, yeah, and then you can just pass on the mic to the gentleman behind you. And after you're done with your question, of course.
Hi, first of all, thank you for this insightful discussion. This is very fruitful to hear your opinions. And I feel like I want to hear your opinion on one more aspect. We have been tackling the Syrian crisis and Ukrainian crisis because both are huge humanitarian disasters. And my question would be, if you reflect on European response to both back in 2015 and now for Ukrainians, how would you assess the European commitment, willingness and ability to help? Thank you.
We'll get the second question as well, and then we'll sort of divide and see how we get that done in the next 3 minutes.
Khalid from Finance, IRC Germany. I think I'm just following up on what Sedona said. Too many points to mention, but since Syria was mentioned in this dialogue, I just wanted to say something that Bashar Assad is a dictator. He's not a nice person. He's a dictator, and he went to be a terrorist who was recognized legally in the global world. First, second, I don't feel actually sorry for the Syrian people. I feel sorry for our democracy and our humanitarian dialogue who failed to pass the exam. And I think the Syrian people and the revolution showed the whole planet how we failed in this. And it's so important, as you also mentioned, that education is the solution to have justice. So it's so important also to educate ourselves, knowing the history behind colonialism and the history and for each and every area and country in specific, and to give the ability and possibility or the chance for Syrians or Somalians to represent themselves better than us representing them.
Thank you. So we'll just take the question that I'll just repeat it. So it's the response, the European response versus to Ukraine versus the response to the crisis or the conflict, the war in Syria. I guess we could maybe start with Ruham and we'll just work our way along. And we have 2 minutes left. So I think I would really be strict, say about 30 seconds for every response.
Well, that's gonna be a bit hard. Well, yeah, it's a very important question that you have raised. Thank you for that. Actually, whenever I think about this topic, I always have like conflicting thoughts and ideas and feelings. I have been here in Germany a bit longer before 2015, and I have witnessed how the German people moved to receive Syrians from the Bahnhof and the stations and carrying teddy bears and flowers. And I didn't see this scene in the Ukrainian case, but it was exactly the opposite on the politics level. And sadly, we don't have our politica here with us. But on the political level, we have seen the German government and German politics actively engage to welcome and support Ukrainian refugees. I don't say that this should not be the case, but actually this should have been also the case for the Syrian people. This is actually not only for the sake of the Syrian refugees and other refugees, Afghanis and African refugees, but also this is for the sake of the German people themselves to try to cover that gap between the newcomers and the social and the German society is actually the one task of the politics. And we have seen how politics succeeded in directly integrating refugees, Ukrainian refugees, politically, legally, and even in the education and the schools now in Germany. But all of these processes took very long, and some people suffering until now in this integration. So the Ukrainian case shows us that integration is possible when there is a willingness from the politics also to support this integration. And we mean here like a true commitment through legal legislations and also politicians supporting or advocating for welcoming refugees in the society level. So in both aspects, I mean, and yeah, we hope that since the government, I hope that the Ukrainian case now, or the success of integrating Ukrainians is going to be like the new model of integration and welcoming people in Germany and in Europe in general. Thank you.
All right.
So one is, we always have to be extremely careful when talking about war in the comfort of Berlin or Paris or New York, because we are not under the bombs. So advocating for the use of force when you are not on the battlefield is morally doubtful, I would say. Now, the reality is the use of force, war, and peace are dancing together. And if you use force, that should be a way to increase your leverage at the table of talks. The use of force should always be combined with a negotiation strategy. What I have not seen in Syria and what I'm not seeing in Ukraine is a credible negotiation strategy. What I have not seen in Afghanistan is a credible negotiation strategy. So 20 years of war in Afghanistan, was it too much or too little? The question is there to be raised, but there was a point where you could have open talks with the devil. You could have open talks with the Taliban, and you could have tried to find a compromise that safeguarded the very basic rights of the people, but also answered to their call for security and to their call for a form of governance which is not necessarily the form of governance we think is the model. So my answer to you is our track record in mingling in other people's business over the last few decades is not good. And I think that we should learn from that. On the other hand, I think that our track record of solidarity is quite admirable, actually, but we have to be careful not to have selective empathy. At the end of the day, somebody who is vulnerable wherever he or she comes from. Thank you.
30 seconds. I think it's a good point to end on. The response to crises around the world is very uneven, and as we go into this era of geopolitics, it's going to have more competition and rivalry and conflict. That's what we need to keep an eye on. The humanitarian response, political response is centered on people's needs and aspirations, on their rights, and not on politics and the interests of governments and warring parties.
All right. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Ruham, Hawash, Alexandre, Liebeskind, and of course, Sam Duerden. And all of you, of course. And I think Corinna has, of course, a closing statement, and we shot over a bit, but thank you.
Just really quickly, thank you so much, Chiponda, for the moderation. Before I will bid you farewell after this very interesting discussion, I would like to extend my words of thanks, dear Ruham Hawash, dear Alexandre Liebeskind, dear Sam. Thank you so much for making the time to come here to join us, for your food for thought. I think I will definitely think about it for quite a while longer. Dear Chiponda Chimbelu, thank you so much for the great moderating task you took on tonight. Dear audience here inside and those joining online, thank you so much for your attention, your participation, your questions and comments, and I hope we will see one another in shortly. And for the guests here in Berlin, I would like to invite you for a small reception here behind us, and for all those who've joined us online, I bid you farewell, bye-bye, and thank you so much.